Hello and welcome. My name's Brad Elliott, and this is Different Conversations, where every week we have a different academic from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, University of Westminster, to talk about their work, their research, and what they're doing at the moment. This week I have with me Professor Guy Osborn. Guy, how's it going this week?
It's good. How are you, Brad?
Oh, I'm doing brilliant, actually. It's just good. It's not amazing. It's not fantastic. Why not?
But just good. Well, I think that's what it's like these days, isn't it? We're in this perpetual hinterland between the two. But yeah, not too bad. Not too bad.
How is your lockdown going so far?
It's been odd. Been odd in all sorts of ways. Missing work, bizarrely, or missing being in work, should I say, rather than missing work, doing lots of work. I think it's taking a lot more time to do the work we have to do. So I'm looking forward to getting back into the buildings. But generally, yeah, it could be worse.
I think as academic as well, and all the academics I talk to, we're weirdly in love, fascinated, passionate about our work, of course. And so I get what you mean. Like, I'm not missing work, I'm missing being at work, I'm missing the research, the colleagues, the collaborators, the talks, the stuff, the things we do that we're passionate about. And that's hard in our living rooms, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And, it's being an academic can be quite a lonely thing. It can be quite an individual thing, but the collective is really important.
And so before we go too much down that pathway of talking about your work as an academic, we should tell people who you are. So what's your elevator pitch, Guy? Who are you and why are people interested in your work?
Well, why they're interested is a different matter, but I am Guy Osborn. I'm a Professor of Law in the Law School at Westminster Law School, University of Westminster. I've been here a long time, and I teach on most levels. At level 7 on our Masters in Entertainment Law, at level 6 in our LLB in Entertainment Law, level 5 Sport and Law, do the dissertation in law. So teach across a lot of areas, and my research is really where law sits within various areas of popular culture. So I do some work on law and music, law and film, law and sport, and various sub-genres or sub-aspects of that.
Yeah, quite a lot of teaching, quite a lot of research, a little bit of work in there. Things you didn't mention that I'm going to embarrass you with because they're on your blurb, and so I've done my research before this. Call to the bar, I'm assuming that's English talk for you're a practicing lawyer or in some way or some.
I'm qualified as a barrister. Yeah, my first degree was in philosophy, and I did a law conversion, and then I became a barrister at 1990, and then did a master's in Leicester and a PhD at Manchester Met with Steve Redhead, the late lamented Professor Steve Redhead, quite a famous author in the field or worker in the field.
Fellow Royal Society of Arts as well.
Yeah, it's much grander than it sounds. It's not as grand as it sounds, but yeah, fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Yeah.
I like to do these things. I like to just a little bit embarrass our people because I think some of the academics we talk to every day, they do amazing things, and we forget because we talk to other people who do amazing things all the time that this is some really big stuff. I mean, it's what our normal is maybe isn't normal for everyone. But anyway, I go off on a tangent. What I want to know about, because I know a bit about your work from our discussions in the past, but I want to tell people about today, is you're a professor of law in the Westminster Law School. That makes sense so far. How does that lead to what I want to talk to today? Your thing, which is grungy concerts in small spaces, because this is what I know you for. So what's that about? What's the link between you being massive in law?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm a big believer that the best research comes out of passion, things you're passionate about. So I've tended right from the beginning to try and do work in areas that I'm passionate about, because I think if you're passionate about it and you talk about that then filters down to the students. So one of the first examples I remember when I just started teaching in the early 90s, I was teaching contract law, first year course. It was Polytechnic of Central London in those days, just before we became University of Westminster. And some parts of contract law can be quite boring, quite mundane. But if you could use a different peg to hang this on, it became quite exciting for the students. George Michael was bringing a case in the High Court about trying to escape from his contract. So I used that as a way in to get the students to think about the context of law, how the law applies, and there's a little peg to hang on that. By the same token, I think if you're conducting research in areas that you care about, you get more out of it. And I think everyone else gets more out of it as well, certainly in terms of public engagement and the public side of it.
Being completely ignorant of law, to be very clear on this matter, as a life scientist, I imagine contract law is particularly awful sounding. So Someone like
Yeah.
George Michael must really drag you into it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it actually happened before that, because a band that I'd followed around the country when I was a student called the Stone Roses had a case before that. So I used that as well. So
hold on, just a sec. A small band I followed around the country called the Stone Roses.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. It was before the first album came out, so a long time ago. And that's when they played the Polytechnic, played our old Students' Union, which was in Bolsover Street, just up from Riding House Street. They played there in 1988. And I was there with another 40 other people, I guess, something like that, back in those days.
People in the Student Union building.
Universities, music runs through its DNA. And we had John Ronson, was the our ENSEC at that point, and he was booking all sorts of brilliant bands like Jonathan Richman, Bradford, Colourblind Jane's Experience, all sorts of great bands. And one of the projects we worked on, you asked me about why stuck in these dark places, these dark basements of the university. Some of the work we've looked at is to try and map that history, map the history of music at the university, because everyone thinks about that period between 1965 to 1970, when in Little Titchfield Street we had Jimi Hendrix's first performance in the UK on stage with Cream, where we had Fleetwood Mac play at least twice, where we had Robert Wyatt's Soft Machine, where we had The Who, and all these great bands were playing, but everyone was talking about the 60s. And what I tried to do, and I had a lot of help here with from a research assistant called Alex Hancock, who was a graduate in creative writing. And the archives at Westminster are brilliant. I always like to give them a shout out. So Anna, Elaine, and everyone in the archives are fantastic. We actually tried to move the centre of gravity away from the 60s to that Polytechnic of Central London period. We mapped a lot of the gigs that took place over those years. So we found all sorts of great examples and instances through that period.
So I happen to teach a class at our lecture theatre in Little Titchfield Street. And I get it's been redeveloped a couple of times since the 80s, perhaps. But I'm claiming that means I've shared a stage with Jimi Hendrix, right? That's fair. That's a fair statement, isn't it?
You have. You've channeled the ghost of Roger Daltrey. You've done all sorts of things.
Fantastic. That's so cool. Because we have a theatre at Little Titchfield Street, kind of. The Soho Poly was based there for a long time, wasn't it?
That's right. And at this point, I should say that the Soho Poly and the whole Soho Poly project, as we call it, it's something that's not just me. It's really Matt Morrison was the person that started this, and Matt can't be here today, but it was Matt's passion for theatre and Matt's passion for that space that really got us into this in many ways. Because when he was conducting research for his PhD on alternative theatre in London in that period between sort of the late 60s and the late 80s into the 90s, he found this presupposing little door in Riding House Street and found out that is where the Soho Poly Theatre was between 1972 and 1990. And he went down those steps, and steps that many of us may have been down in the past 3 or 4 years as we've tried to open it up a little bit, and found it full of rubbish. In fact, I'd actually been down in that room about 10 years before, when it was just used by the registry. The registry used to be above it, and they put all the old exam papers and all the old paperwork down there, and it was a horrendous looking place. And that was the space, and Matt rediscovered it, and it's really, Matt that found it in the first place back in 2012 and reinvigorated it.
There's a quote I've just pulled out, and I don't normally do this, but I want to read this quote out loud when I was researching, because I didn't know anything about the Soho Poly for this session. And when we talk about it, because it's not there anymore, is it? It's of course moved now. But during that period between somewhere in the 60s and the 80s, and you're correct me on the exact dates, it was a theatre space. But we're not talking about a large, grand area. There's this quote here: the theatre space comprised of a former underground garage with a hydraulic lift shaft pit as a dressing room and a tiny hatch from which cheap food was sold, as well as doubling as a lighting box. This was a converted garage. This was just a basement somewhere. This was the space that had these really amazing events and venues. Events and people.
It's an amazing space. And I have to say, everyone who comes into the space loves it and gets a sense of it. Well, people react in different ways. I went down there. I think you interviewed Michael Riley a few weeks ago.
That's correct.
When I took Michael down there, he said it was like going into the 100 Club, which is a famous venue, probably 500 yards away from where the theatre actually is. Our Vice Chancellor, Peter Bonfield, who loves the space, is a big supporter of the space. He said it was like when he went down to Bath Moles Club in his student days to see the Stranglers. So you might want to edit that out. I don't know, but
I'm keeping it. 100% keeping it.
But so everyone has it's like a resonance to the space, but it is tiny. It's a really small space. But it was the concept of the space was, as the Soho Poly, it was all about lunchtime theatre. It was very democratic. It was anti-elitist. Mm-hmm. The idea was theatre could be seen as being something a little bit inaccessible. You had to dress up. You had to get a babysitter. You had to. It's often quite expensive. This was something that was very open, very, as I say, very democratic. You'd come at lunchtime. It'd be 50 minutes long, and you could get some culture in your day by doing that. Very much part of the ethos of the University of Westminster generally, in many ways, and our historic view about the working man's university and opening up education to all and accessibility and being different and all these sort of things. It's very much part of that. So it was in that basement between 1972 and 1990, and had some amazing things go on during that period. So, some of the, if you go down there now, you'll see some photographs on the wall by Nobby Clark, the famous theatre photographer. Mm-hmm. On these photos, there's Bob Hoskins from when he was down there. There's all sorts of great actors of the period, all cut their teeth down in that little room that held 40 people.
That's fantastic. It's so cool. And when I was reading about it as well, I think you talked about it a bit. It was used with democratic. It's almost subversive, but it was different intentionally. It was, as you put it, it was for anybody. I've got 2 quotes today. I've never done quotes before on this recording. Yeah. I'm going to go with my second one today because I love it so much. There was no board of directors. There was no rules. The spirit of the place was anarchist. Good job, Brad. Glad I said that on recording. Wood was smashed up with real axes on stage for one production. Another production filled the space with the stench of petrol. It just goes on. It sounds like it was a fantastic, amazing, exciting thing.
Yeah, I think you've got to remember that, we've got quite a radical history anyway at the Polytechnic at that period we were Polytechnic of Central London between 1970 and 1992. And this corresponds to a certain degree with that period. We had all sorts of, really exciting, radical things going on, I think, at the university more generally. But the sort of things going on down there were amazing. We'd have plays like Barry Keefe, who sadly died a couple of months ago, did a play called Sus about the stop and search laws. Very pertinent, very topical now. That was premiered down there. There was all sorts of radical feminist theatre work going on down there. So yes, some amazing things.
And then we talk about it as in the past, like it's gone away now, because of course the Soho Poly did move out and become a much bigger theatre in Soho.
Yeah, the Soho Theatre moved in 1990, and now see it on Dean Street. I think it's Dean Street. Quite an amazing space with all sorts of different rooms and things going on. But its radical heart, I believe, Matt probably backed me up, is in that Soho Poly period between 72 and 1990. But
it's not like it's gone completely. I mean, just because we're stuck at home in lockdown, I understand there's still events running, there's still online activities, there's still things happening in this spirit, if you will.
I think there's 2 things there, Brad. First of all, in a physical sense, there's all sorts of things going on to try and renovate, well, not so much renovate, more reimagine the theatre. From the modern audience, it's not really a very comfortable space to be in many ways. From a health and safety perspective, there's all sorts of problems. So we can only use the space in very limited fashion. Mm-hmm. So we have to go through all sorts of health and safety risk assessments before we can put things on.
Are you saying there's no axes and petrol anymore?
Well, not yet. Maybe we'll get you down there. But so far, excellent. No, we haven't done that. But things like wheelchair accessibility, things like even the ingress and egress, the widths of the stairwells to get in, all these aren't suitable for a modern day period. So we're working on it in 2 ways. We've used it for various things. We've had a series of events in there. I think we've put on around 25 events over the last 4 years, partly funded by the AHRC and the British Academy as part of their Being Human, partly funded by the institution, the Westminster itself. And we've put on things like, we had, for the first Being Human, we had a mixture of poetry. We've got a long poetry history at the university. Ezra Pound taught here. All sorts of other famous poets have taught over the years. And we had 5 days of poetry at lunchtime to break up the day with poetry, to disrupt the day with poetry. We commissioned a an installation, a digital theatre installation in the space. We had some other talks about the space itself. In 2018, we put on a 50th anniversary play of One Autumn Evening in the space, which was fantastic. So there's all sorts of things been going on in there in the physical space, but at the moment we're trying to secure funding to actually make it compliant to the modern day requirements. And in tandem with that, we're looking at some other funding for looking at the history and looking at the interpretation of that history and how that might be used outside of that with the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Mm-hmm. But even though, like I think you were hinting at, I've come a long way to get to what you were actually after. When lockdown occurred, we were about to have what we call the Soho Poly at 50. Mm-hmm. We were recreating the Soho Poly Arts Club, really, because before it was the Soho Poly, it was an arts workshop. And when we did some work into the space, Matt had done this period when it was the theatre. We dug a bit deeper and found it was an arts workshop before this, and it was a brilliant space where they had the Poly Folk Club was based down there. They had photography down there. All the posters that we have in the Little Titchfield Street up in the ground floor of all the bands, they were all screen printed down in that basement. All sorts of things went on in that space, and we put together a series of events to sort of commemorate that. Some of the performances that took place down there, some of the events, workshops, etc. With the lockdown, we obviously did about 2 of these, then it all went pear-shaped and we couldn't put these things on. So the first thing we thought, well, we'll just have to postpone them and put them on somewhere else. But then about 3 weeks in, I said, well, actually, one of the concepts we do is a thing called ghost gigs. Mm-hmm. They've been really successful. We've done about 6 of them in the various spaces at the university. And the idea of a ghost gig draws upon the ethos of the Soho Poly, the lunchtime theatre, the disrupting your day with culture idea, but also draws on the history of the university and its musical DNA, its musical archaeology. So what we do is, if we can source a recording of a concert that took place at the university, we then try and put that on the day it took place, in as far as we can, the space it took place, and we invite people to come along to sort of, well, almost as a social way to just hear some music at lunchtime, to talk to other people, and to celebrate what went on. And they've been really good. We had one with New Order in New Cavendish Street. We've had Fleetwood Mac in the we had New Order in New Cavendish Street. We've had ones in the Soho Poly itself from the Folk Club. Had Maureen Kennedy Martin and Michael Clare in there. But we had 2 that were coming up that were actually quite important ones in some ways. One was Fleetwood Mac, which took place in the Little Titchfield Theatre that you talked about earlier on, and one was Ralph McTell, which was the last concert to take place over there. We were going to do those in the building during lockdown. Because we couldn't do it, I decided to try and do this in a virtual sense. So we did the first online ghost gigs, and we did those in April and May. Mm-hmm. And they were pretty successful. We got about 60 or 70 people come to both of them, and people seem to like them.
Yeah, I really like this theme. You term it under the umbrella term. I can't remember if we mentioned it or not already, but the term was disrupt your everyday. Yeah. And the idea being that perhaps we do forget that sometimes we need difference. We need a bit of something alternative, something not our normal. And I really genuinely think at the moment, as we were chatting about before we started this interview, with us just doing the same thing every day, getting up, perhaps going to the kitchen table, then doing your work and then going to the living room and stopping, we're not getting that anymore. So there's a real chance here for people to experience some disruption online.
You're right, Brad. But in a funny way, on the first day of lockdown, I came home, and it was very odd going home, and not the first day, but the first day the university was really shutting down, that last week before the 23rd when Boris Johnson shut everything down. Mm-hmm. And I remember a lot of the concerts were stopping already. And when I got back, I went online and saw Cafe Otto over in Dalston were putting gigs on with 20 rooms. And it was quite eerie watching these sort of things, watching just somebody performing in a room with nobody in it, because they said, well, they were going to come anyway. We can't put people in there now. Let's do them. And then we got things like Tim Burgess out of the Charlatans putting on what he called Tim's Twitter listening parties. We said, well, one thing we could do is we could all listen to an album together, and we could get the person that made the album to tweet at the same time, and we could listen to something together, but alone. So there are opportunities for these sort of things, that even though we are missing culture, we can do new methods and new ideas to try and embrace that. But yeah, I'm missing it loads. You know, I go to loads of gigs and loads of things, and yeah, missing that part of it massively.
I think it's become really interesting how much this experience is driven by people, isn't it? Because like you say, when we go to a gig, a lot of it is about the shared experience. I mean, normally the sound isn't as good. It's not quite the same experience as putting on a good set of headphones and listening to it with high quality. So it's not that, is it? It's about more than that. It's about the experience. So yeah. I don't know where I'm going with this point, I think, but I think it's really interesting that you're trying to recreate it in different ways so you can still have a group experience online.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. There's some idea that, you know, we used to talk about the water cooler moment, where everyone, when we had 3 or 4 TV channels, everyone would watch things at the same time. The next day that became a point of departure or a point to talk about for them. Because of time shifting, because we watch things that binge on a box set, we don't get that. But this sort of recreates that thing again, and you have that experience coterminously. You have it at the same time with people, and it becomes more of a sort of a cooperative or collaborative event in some way. Mm-hmm. But you know, I think there's all sorts of interesting things around it. When we talk about disrupt the everyday, and I like your badge very much, Brad, which is a badge that's based on we did a Redskins ghost gig the day after the election. The Redskins were a very left-wing band in the 1980s who in the talk we did, I called it Skinhead Socialist Soul, and it was the day after the election, so I was hoping it would be some sort of celebration, but it wasn't. Not many people came, to be perfectly honest. But that's a badge based on the iconography of the Redskins at the time, sort of constructivist sort of approach, with Disrupt Your Everyday. With Disrupt Your Everyday, the concept that underlies the work in the theatre, the work with the ghost gigs, all the work we do, is that we think culture is important, and it enriches your day, it's good for your mental health, it's good for you on all sorts of levels. Mm. When we talk about disruption, the disruption for the Soho Poly was saying, let's move the time. Let's say it's not really about the evening performances that people might not get to do it in the day. We've tried to disrupt the spaces a little bit as well, but also we're very cognizant of the fact that whereas lunchtime theatre, which was radical in the 1970s, when we had very maybe traditional work forms and 9-to-5 type jobs was one thing, but now we have all sorts of people in different atypical work forms, night workers, and the global economy means that what's lunchtime in London is probably tea time in Mumbai and probably nighttime in Sydney. So we've tried to be aware of the potentiality of digitization and the internet to actually make this disruption even bigger than it was in 1970, 50 years ago.
I think you've exactly preempted my next question, because we talk about disruption, and like you said, when everyone had a lunch break from 12 to 1, because that's what happened. Is disruption now digital? Is disruption online? Is disruption delivery of these alternative cultural media in ways that everybody can consume, freely available type thing? Well,
that's a really good point, Brad, actually, because I think it's true. There's all sorts of potentialities with disruption. But I should also say, in tandem with this idea about disrupt your everyday and how culture is good, we have a different part of this. And one of our underlying guiding principles is that we want it to be democratic. And democratic not just in terms of you can go and see these things, we make a point that all our things are free and accessible and we stream them and do all these sort of things, but also that they might be a catalyst for people to go and do these things themselves. And we draw inspiration from the sort of punk movement, I guess, and the idea encapsulated by Mark Perriman in the fanzine Sniffing Glue, where he basically reproduced on the fanzine Sniffing Glue 3 chords. Here's an A, here's an E, here's a G, now form a band. The idea that, you know, this is all you need, go and do it yourself. And one of the things we try and do with the Soho Poly idea, the Soho Poly project, is to encourage people to do these things themselves, to be a catalyst for people to go and take on the cudgel and go and do these things. So some of the recent things we've done, which has really been Matt's sort of baby in many ways, but also with Hannah Copley, who's a great creative writing lecturer in the English department as well, has been to work on doing things like memoir workshops for the open age group, which is for people over 50, to give them some different ideas and different things to do. Works with the Fitzrovia Centre, our local community, about creative writing. Working with local schools about workshops. Hannah Copley's doing some work on that particularly. So it's very much the idea that it's not just about us saying this is the culture, go and take it, but you can do this as well. But if, maybe go, oh, I could do this. I like knitting. I'll do a knitting group on my lunch break and some people can come along to that. I like doing, and almost to create that sort of culture, DIY type culture. So that's a catalyst for that. Because the big thing I often say is that to me, there's a spirit in the Soho Poly that needs to be bottled. And this bottle needs to be released throughout the university. And it's not just about the space itself. The space is really important. And I love it. And Matt, we love it dearly. But it's more about the ethos that underlies it and what we can do with it. And you can run with that and take it elsewhere.
Yeah, it's very, very much so. And I really like this democratization of culture angle, because we are in an era very similar to what we've talked about historically, when Rock Against Racism and people were changing society by using subversive culture in a way, where now with a camera and YouTube, we can broadcast a message to so many people or be creative in so many different ways. And even just this podcast, for example, I mean, what do I as a life scientist know about music, race and politics? But this is how we talk about it, I guess. This is the different conversations ethos.
But then within that, Brad, you know loads about it. Your opinion is just as valid as anybody else's. That's what it's about. That's saying that just because you've got the means of production or you've got the means to actually do these things doesn't mean that your point of view isn't valid, that your views on music or politics or culture or whatever aren't as valid as anybody else's. That's really what democratization is about, I think, in this context.
I guess the question is what next? Because we've talked a lot about these exciting projects we have done, but if people want to come see these events or take part and participate, where can we find more information and what's coming up?
Well, I think this is not coming out for a couple of days, which is unfortunate because we've got a great event coming up on Monday.
Yeah, we're just going to miss that, unfortunately.
It's going to be the first commissioned play in the theatre for almost 30 years. And it's by Matt Morrison himself. It's a play called Dance. But that should be available afterwards as well. So what we'll do is we'll make sure there's a link to that you can have so people can go. We
have a link down below, so we'll provide all these to our listeners.
Before the lockdown, we were about to have a exhibition of Cold War Steve prints. Cold War Steve is the Bruegel of Brexit. I don't know if you know Cold War Steve.
No, tell me more.
I'll send you a link to him. He's basically a guy who does sort of a Photoshop pictures on his phone using various famous people, and he's quite brilliant. As I say, he's been called the Bruegel of Brexit. So he uses collage in various ways. So we've got an exhibition of some of his work coming up, which should be brilliant. I think he might even come down to that exhibition. We've got some more. Well, we did a live gig last year, the first live gig in the space for 50 years, where we had Martin Stevenson from the band The Dainties, quite big in the 80s. Performed a show down there. The video's on the website if you want to watch that. Mm-hmm. We're going to put on some more of those. We've got a couple in the pipeline. I can't really announce anything yet, but we've got a couple of things bubbling under, as we say. We've got more plays. Part of this is predicated on what we get in terms of funding. So we're looking at, as I say, National Heritage Lottery stuff at the moment. We've had some success with some bids to the ACC fund at Westminster, which we're delighted about. So we've got a couple of things coming out of that. So we'll have some more ghost gigs later in the year. Donovan played 50 years ago in November. We probably will do that. But again, whether it will be on site or online, we're not sure. Probably will be online, I would guess. We're looking at all sorts of things really to do with that. So yeah, commissioning more gigs, more plays. I think I mentioned Barry Keefe earlier on. We're hoping to put on Sus in some form, which was premiered down in the basement all those years ago, about the stop and search laws in the 1970s, very pertinent at the moment. And we might try and have a link there with someone like Stopwatch, who's a group looking at stop and search laws and empowering people to understand their rights in these areas. So we've got various things going on, outreach in schools, other bits and pieces.
I think the easier thing to do, we might have some social media links below, because I know you're quite active on Twitter. I know there's a few, I don't think it's disrupt you every day, but there's a couple of Twitter links I found, especially, and there's a few websites. So we'll definitely make those available to people. And it'll just be a case of keeping up with the news, basically, because it sounds like there's some exciting stuff coming up.
I mean, all the events we put on the Centre for Law, Society and Popular Culture, which is the Westminster research group, all comes on that website as events. But also, the So Poly Project's got its own Twitter feed, my Twitter feed, Matt's Twitter feed. There's all sorts of stuff going on through that. And we do try to put it on the university channels in various ways as well. And we get, when we did New Order at New Cavendish Street, we must have had, we sold it out in the rooms we had. We had about 60, 70 people there, I think.
I wish I'd come to that. It would have been fantastic.
People are hearing about these things.
Brilliant. All right. I think, unfortunately, that's pretty much all we have time for today. So it only really remains for me to say thank you, Professor Guy Osborn, for that very fascinating tour of a professorship in law that has led to research into Westminster's history into music. If you've enjoyed this podcast today, feel free to subscribe, whether or not you're watching the video version of this on YouTube or listening to the audio on Spotify, iTunes, or whichever podcast tool you use. Once again, my name's Brad Elliott, and this has been Different Conversations.